In addition to the two problems we just looked at for the person-space perspective, deGrazia thinks that there are a couple of other concerns with approaching death from this point of view. One of them is quite simply, it implies that there are way too many people who are dead. Because on the person-space perspective, anyone who is not a person counts as dead. Remember, personhood requires more than just consciousness, right? Consciousness is just sort of the necessary condition. It's not sufficient for consciousness or for personhood. Personhood also requires all these other rational capacities, sense of self over time, all those sorts of things. And the implication here is that anybody who doesn't have those qualities, they're not persons. Well, not only does this imply that we were never newborns, it also implies that infants are currently dead, and they will suddenly come to life when they become persons. Alzheimer's patients are dead in many cases, especially if their condition is sufficiently severe. Anyone with a serious memory deficit, because they don't have a sense of themselves over time. We tend to think that's important for personhood. Also, people with delusional disorders, other kinds of mental disorders, they're all going to count as not being persons. One example of this is, this is just something interesting to Google if you get bored. There is a famous neuroscience case of a patient by the name of H.M. He has passed away, so we now know that his real identity is a gentleman named Henry Mollison. He, due to a procedure to treat his epilepsy, his epileptic seizures, suffers from very serious memory deficits. Basically, he can't form new, what are called, well, we'll just call them autobiographical memories. He can sort of remember facts and things like that, but he can't remember, things that happened to him 5 minutes ago. He's sort of an extreme case of a memory deficit. He technically wouldn't count as a person, I think, on this view, and so he's not morally responsible. For example, he doesn't know his own history very well. He couldn't tell you the history of his life beyond the surgery that occurred. It's one of the weird things about his case. But he doesn't seem dead, right? He's sort of up and walking around, he's doing stuff every day, he talks to people, he has hobbies. It's just that he doesn't have all the qualities of personhood. deGrazia says that on the person-based approach, people like HM are dead. And that's crazy, right? So another odd implication here is just that on the person-space perspective, way too many people count as dead that are clearly just not dead. It's just ridiculous to think of them as dead. All right, there's one additional problem that we want to look at, and this is a problem that specifically targets the value-based argument for the higher brain standard of death. Remember, what that argument says is that not that the higher brain standard is right or that we are sort of fundamentally persons, but because of the loss of meaning that goes with the loss of consciousness, we should adopt the higher brain standard as a kind of value commitment, right? Like we should recognize that our lives would be valueless in this state, and so we should think of people who have this permanent loss of consciousness as, for all practical purposes, dead. Now, deGrazia says, look, even if it's true that a loss of consciousness would render our lives meaningless in this way, it doesn't follow that we're actually dead, right? There's an important difference between claims about whether a life would be meaningful and claims about whether the being we're talking about actually is alive. deGrazia says, look, if we're talking about meaninglessness as a basis for thinking that certain kinds of lives sort of don't count as being alive, we'd worry about lives without self-awareness, or maybe just the ability to socialize with others. There's a sense in which those kinds of lives lack important meaning too, and those kinds of qualities apply to very young children or severely disabled persons. It doesn't imply that those people are dead. So again, we have this concern that if we move from claims about meaninglessness to claims about who is alive and who is dead, we end up saying that way too many people are dead. Anyone whose life is sort of meaningless in this way is going to count as dead. So that's one worry, and the other is just that the implication doesn't apply here. It doesn't follow from the fact that a life would lack meaning. It doesn't follow that the person whose life we're talking about is actually dead. In fact, when we think about other contexts where we talk about lives being effectively meaningless, it doesn't follow that those people are dead. You might think that the life of, say, a sort of death row inmate or someone convicted of life in prison who's never going to get out, or someone in long periods of solitary confinement or something like that. You might think that their life is meaningless in certain respects, but they're not. They're clearly still alive, right? I mean, we don't treat them like they're dead. We don't think that they're dead. So there's just, in general, there's no obvious connection between what makes a life meaningful and when a person counts as dead. All right, let's just sum up here. What DeGrazia has argued here is just that the person-space approach to defining death has a number of really problematic implications. As we've seen, the we were never newborns argument, 2 deaths for 1 organism argument, way too many people are dead, and the fact that what makes a life meaningful doesn't imply anything about whether the person we're talking about is actually alive. There's sort of a logic failure there. The biological approach doesn't have any of those implications, right? Because it just focuses on when the organism is not alive. So it doesn't have any of these concerns that follow from the person-space approach. However, so what that implies, DeGrazia says, is that of the 2 methodologies, the biological approach is the better one because it does not have crazy implications, and the person-space approach does. So take the person-space approach, throw it out. We need to think about death from a biological point of view. Well, as we saw in one of the very first DeGrazia lecture clips, the biological approach isn't consistent with the higher brain standard of death. Why is that? Well, it's because the biological approach defines death in terms of a certain kind of integrated functioning, and people with higher brain death still have that. People in persistent vegetative states still have enough brainstem activity to regulate the sort of activities of the subsystems of their body that are necessary to keep their body alive. It's just that they don't have consciousness. So if the biological approach rules out the higher brain standard and the biological approach is the right methodology, what we should do is abandon the higher brain standard of death. Now notice what's going on here. Unlike the Harvard Committee, DeGrazia is focusing on what's actually right, like what's the actual correct definition of death. So when we get into, and I'm going to ask you to think about this for the discussion board, this is one thing you need to keep in mind when you're answering the discussion board prompt. Should physicians be concerned with the practical stuff, like the Harvard Committee is, and like the value-based argument for the higher brain standard is, or should we be concerned with getting the definition of death right? Should medicine be committed to a correct definition of death, or like a workable, useful definition of death, a definition of death that reflects our value commitments or something like that? Okay, let's conclude by just talking about policy implications, because remember, one of the reasons that people want to go to the higher brain standard of death is similar to the reasons that they wanted to move to the whole brain standard, is that we don't want these situations where we're obligated to continue to treat people for these massively extended periods of time. I mean, patients in persistent vegetative states can survive for an extremely long time, especially with certain kinds of nutritional and hydration support. You might think that those sorts of cases are going to be burdensome to medical providers and families and hospitals in the same way that the quote-unquote irreversible coma cases were that motivated the Harvard Committee. Well, DeGrazia says, look, just because we don't think people in persistent vegetative states are dead doesn't mean that we have to sort of treat them indefinitely. Patients have a pretty well-grounded right to refuse treatment, right? And so in cases of persistent vegetative states, patients can rely on advanced directives that can specify, hey, if I'm in what is confirmed as a persistent vegetative state, stop hydration and nutrition. And I mean, the body basically starves to death, but the thought is that because there's no consciousness, it's not painful. We don't know that, it's a hypothesis, but it seems it's pretty scientifically well-grounded. And even for people who don't have advanced directives, so long as you have surrogate decision makers, they can make the decision to terminate care, right? We think that we don't, just because we don't think people in persistent vegetative states are dead, it doesn't mean that we're therefore obligated to treat them forever. Their families can say, it's time. Let's go ahead and withdraw support and let them die of a lack of hydration and nutrition. And DeGrazia also says, look, if persistent vegetative state patients can pay for their treatment and they want to receive it, they should get it, right? I mean, obviously we don't want patients in persistent vegetative states to be paid for by certain kinds of, insurance plans, right? That's unfair to the other people on the insurance. Although one thing that's interesting about deGrazia, he notes that, you might let people specify whether they want PVS care as a condition of their insurance, and then you just put people who all want it into one insurance group, and you put people who don't want it in a different insurance group. So the only people who pay for these cases are other people who would want it for themselves. So you could even have some insurance coverage for this stuff, but you don't want like Medicaid or Medicare covering this, right? And deGrazia says there's no reason to think that that's an obligation that we have. But it doesn't follow that PVS patients who are maybe especially wealthy are in one of these, PVS care included insurance plans. There's no reason to think that they can't have that care if they really want it. And then the other concern, remember, that led people to move towards brain-based criteria was wanting to get more organs, right? Wanting to be able to have a better chance of allocating organs for transplant. And deGrazia doesn't really respond to this too extensively, so you should think about whether this response is satisfactory. He says, well, one thing we could do is abandon the dead donor rule. We could just specify that, look, a person doesn't have to be dead for us to take their organs. If they sort of allow that in a persistent vegetative state, you can extract my organs with the understanding that this will effectively end my life. That's okay with me. You might think that is something we could do. deGrazia thinks that that's too extreme, though, and his basis for that claim is entirely sort of empirical. He just thinks, look, the difference between the number of organs we get now and the number of organs we would get if we were allowed to take organs from patients in a persistent vegetative state is negligible. It's not a sufficient number of organs to justify abandoning something as important as the dead donor rule. And you might also think that there are worries here about whether doctors should be doing things that will sort of willfully or directly kill the patient. That's sort of a different kind of debate, but that's lurking in the background here. I think deGrazia has a particular conception of what medicine is about, and he's not so clear that taking organs for the sake of transplant is going to qualify as either treatment or as a perhaps justifiable form of killing. Because there's a way to justify even things like active euthanasia as medically legitimate if you sort of frame them as treatment in certain kinds of ways, as relief of suffering and what have you. You can't give that kind of argument in the case of the dead donor rule. You're not relieving patients' suffering when you take organs from a PVS patient. All you're doing is sort of helping out some other person. So you don't get the same kinds of justifications here. So the point is that you might want to keep the dead donor rule because you think killing shouldn't be a part of medicine. You also might want to keep the dead donor rule because you're worried about slippery slope worries, because you're worried that we're going to start taking organs from perfectly healthy people. The other reason, that's kind of a far-fetched one, but it's certainly one people might mention. And then the third reason you might not want to abandon the dead donor rule is because maybe you think that killing is permissible in medicine when it's to relieve suffering that can't be treated any other way. But that justification doesn't apply here, so you can't say the same kind of thing about organ removal as you can about like active euthanasia, for example. Okay, that last little bit got us a bit into some medical ethics stuff, but I think it's important to think about, just beyond what the article says, why we might want to retain something like the dead donor rule. I mean, it is actually a pretty important rule, pretty well-grounded in medicine, and there are sort of good reasons for thinking that. And you might think that it's a good rule even if you're in favor of things like physician-assisted suicide and active euthanasia. It doesn't, just because you think some cases of medical killing, if you think that's killing, that doesn't follow that you have to sort of endorse all forms of killing in medicine. And this organ extraction seems like an importantly different kind of case. All right, so the question is about how deGrazia accommodates this point about a greater number of viable organs due to the higher brain's definition of death. Basically just reiterating what I just said. You want to pick that from the choices. And that's going to conclude our discussion of medical definitions of death, so go ahead and complete the assignment here. Keep in mind, again, once you submit this material, you're not going to be able to re-access the lecture material. Although if you Google my name on YouTube, you'll find my channel, and all of the posts from this module are going to be there on YouTube. So you could re-access them that way if you wanted to. I brought that up in the syllabus. I'll just mention it here again. From there, make sure you get your discussion board posts done on time. Address all the points of that discussion board post because there are several components that you want to take note of, and move on to the module assignment from there.